The escape pod fell through the dark sky like a burning stone, its metal body glowing red from the heat of entering the atmosphere of the frozen planet below. Inside the small pod, a young dragon named Vyrath held onto the safety straps with all his strength, his small claws digging into the fabric as the whole world shook around him. He was only 12 cycles old, which in human years would make him about 7 years old, still a baby by the standards of his species, the Draconeth. His scales were the color of fresh emeralds, bright green, with hints of gold near his belly and under his wings. But they were still soft, not yet hardened by age and time like the scales of adult dragons. The pod shook again, and Vyrath closed his eyes, trying not to cry, trying to be brave like his mother had told him to be. He remembered what happened on the ship, how the alarms had started screaming in the middle of the night cycle, how his father had grabbed a weapon and run toward the bridge, while his mother picked Vyrath up in her arms. "Raiders," she had said, her voice calm, even though her eyes showed fear. "Pirates who attacked trade ships and took everything they could find." She had carried him through the smoke-filled corridors of their family vessel, past fires and broken walls, until they reached the escape pods. There were only seconds to spare when she pushed him inside the small pod and pressed the button to close the door. The last thing Vyrath saw before the door sealed shut was his mother turning around, spreading her great wings wide, fire building in her throat as she prepared to fight the raiders who were coming down the hallway. Then the pod launched, and Vyrath was alone, shooting away from the only home he had ever known, watching through the tiny window as his family's ship grew smaller and smaller, until it was just a dot of light among the stars. The pod's computer had chosen the nearest planet with a breathable atmosphere, a frozen world called Kepler 442b that humans had colonized about 50 years ago. Vyrath did not know much about humans, except what his mother had told him during their long journeys between trading posts. She said they were strange creatures, soft and pink, with no scales to protect them, no fire in their bellies, no wings to carry them through the sky. But she also said they were everywhere in the galaxy, spreading to every corner of space, building homes on worlds that would kill most other species. They were survivors, she had said, and that was something to respect, even if they looked weak. The ground came up fast, and the pod hit hard, bouncing once, twice, 3 times before sliding across a field of ice and snow, and finally stopping when it crashed into a large pile of frozen dirt. Vyrath hung in his straps for a long moment, his head spinning, pain shooting through his left wing, where something had hit it during the rough. He reached up with shaking claws and pressed the button to open the door, and cold air rushed in like a living thing, wrapping around him with icy fingers. The cold was like nothing Vyrath had ever felt before. His species came from a desert world where the sun burned hot and the sand was warm even at night. They were creatures of fire and heat, their bodies designed to thrive in temperatures that would cook most other beings. This frozen world was the opposite of everything his body needed, and he felt the cold immediately start to drain the strength from his muscles. He climbed out of the pod and fell into snow that came up to his chest, white and cold and wet against his soft scales. His left wing hung at a bad angle, bent in a way that wings should not bend, and when he tried to move it, pain exploded through his whole body. Dark blood dripped from a cut above his left eye, running down his face and falling into the snow, made small red holes in the white surface. Vyrath looked around at this alien world and felt very small and very alone. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds, and snow was falling gently, adding to the thick blanket that covered everything as far as he could see. But in the distance, maybe a mile or 2 away, he could see lights, small squares of yellow and orange that meant windows, that meant buildings, that meant people who might help him. He started walking toward the lights, his small feet sinking into the snow with every step, his broken wing dragging behind him, leaving a trail of blood that the falling snow slowly covered. Each step was harder than the last, as the cold worked its way deeper into his body. Dragons were not meant for cold places, and Vyrath could feel his strength leaving him bit by bit, like water draining from a container with a hole in the bottom. But he kept walking, because there was nothing else he could do. Thought about his mother and father. Wondered if they were still alive, if they had fought off the raiders, or if they were gone forever. He was too young to understand death fully, but he understood absence, understood that he might never see them again, and that thought made his chest hurt worse than his broken wing. The first building he reached was a small house with a red door, and smoke coming from a chimney on the roof. Vyrath stood at the door for a moment, gathering his courage, remembering how his father knocked on doors at trading posts, 3 firm knocks with the back of his hand. He raised his small fist and knocked, the sound weak against the heavy wood. The door opened, and a human female stood there, her eyes going wide when she saw him, her mouth opening in a scream that hurt Vyrath's ears. She slammed the door so fast that the wind from it pushed Vyrath backward, and he fell into the snow, landing on his broken wing, crying out in pain. He lay there for a moment, tears mixing with the blood on his face, trying to understand what he had done wrong, why she had been so afraid of him. But there was no time to think about it, because the cold was getting worse, and he needed to find help soon, or he would freeze to death on this strange world. He got up slowly, painfully, and looked down the road at the other houses, their lights glowing in the growing darkness of the evening. Someone would help him, he told himself. Someone had to help him. He started walking again, leaving the red door behind, heading toward the next house and the next chance at survival. The snow kept falling, covering his tracks, covering the blood, covering everything in white silence, while the small green dragon walked on through the cold, hoping to find kindness in a world full of strangers. The second house was bigger than the first one, with 2 floors and many windows that glowed with warm light from inside. Vyrath could see shadows moving behind the curtains, shapes of humans going about their evening routines, unaware that a small dragon was standing outside their home, bleeding and freezing in the snow. He walked up to the front door, his legs shaking so badly that he almost fell twice on the short path from the road to the entrance. His scales had started to turn pale, losing their bright green color as the cold drained the life from them, and his tail had gone completely numb, dragging behind him like a dead thing. He knocked on the door, using more strength this time, making sure the sound would be heard over whatever noises were happening inside. Then he waited, his breath making small clouds in the freezing air, his heart beating fast with hope and fear mixed together. No one came to the door. He knocked again, harder, small fist hurting from hitting the cold wood, but still no one answered. Through the window beside the door, he could see a room with comfortable chairs and a fire burning in a fireplace, the flames dancing and warm, so close and yet impossible to reach. A human child ran past the window, chasing something Vyrath could not see, laughing with joy, completely unaware of the young dragon who would have given anything to feel that warmth for just a moment. Vyrath knocked one more time, but he knew it was useless. Either they could not hear him, or they had seen him and chosen to ignore him, to pretend he was not there, hoping he would go away. He stepped back from the door, his shoulders dropping with disappointment, and looked at the next house down the road. It was smaller, with a single light in the front window, and Vyrath forced his tired legs to carry him toward it. The snow was deeper here, almost up to his waist in some places, and every step was a battle against his own exhausted body. His broken wing sent sharp pains through his back whenever he moved, and the cut above his eye had started bleeding again, the blood freezing on his face in thin red lines. The translator chip in his ear, a small device that all young Draconeth received to help them understand other species, had been damaged in the crash. It made crackling sounds whenever he tried to focus on human words, giving him only bits and pieces of meaning, leaving him unable to explain who he was or what had happened to him. He reached the third house and knocked on the door, his knock weaker than before, his strength fading with every minute he spent in the cold. The door opened, and a man stood there, tall and thick with muscles, his face hard and unfriendly. In his hands he held a weapon, some kind of gun that Vyrath did not recognize, and he pointed it directly at the young dragon's chest. Translator could not fully process, but Vyrath understood the tone, angry and threatening, telling him to go away, to leave, to not come any closer. Vyrath raised his uninjured wing in the gesture of surrender that his mother had taught him. It was a universal sign among many species in the galaxy, a way of showing that you meant no harm, that you were not a threat, that you came in peace. The man did not lower his weapon. He kept shouting, his face red with what might have been fear or anger or both, his finger tight on the trigger of the gun. Vyrath took a step backward, then another, keeping his wing raised, moving slowly so the man would not think he was attacking. The man watched him go, standing in his doorway with his weapon ready, making sure the small dragon left his property. When Vyrath was far enough away, the man went back inside and slammed the door, and Vyrath heard the sound of locks clicking into place, one after another, sealing the warm inside and leaving him alone in the cold. He stood in the middle of the road for a long time, looking at the closed door, feeling something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. He had known that other species sometimes feared dragons. His people were large and powerful when fully grown, with fire in their bellies and claws that could tear through metal, and some species saw them as monsters, as dangerous beasts to be avoided or destroyed. But Vyrath was just a child, small and hurt and scared, and he could not understand why anyone would look at him and see something to fear. Was he really so terrible to look at that humans would rather let him die than offer him shelter from the cold? He started walking again, not because he had hope anymore, but because standing still meant freezing to death, and some small part of him was not ready to give up. The fourth house was at the end of the road, set apart from the others, older and more worn than its neighbors. The paint on the walls was faded and peeling. The fence around the property was broken in several places, and the path to the front door had not been cleared of snow. It looked like a house that belonged to someone who had stopped caring about appearances, someone who lived alone with only memories for company. Vyrath walked up the path, his vision blurring at the edges, his body starting to shut down from the cold. He could no longer feel his feet or his tail, and his thoughts were becoming slow and confused, mixing together like water and oil. He reached the door and raised his fist to knock, but his strength finally gave out, and instead of knocking, he simply fell forward, his small body hitting the door with a soft thump, before sliding down to the ground. He lay there in the snow, curled into a ball, his uninjured wing wrapped around himself in a useless attempt to keep warm. Would die, he thought, alone on a frozen world, 1,000,000 miles from home, with no one to mourn him or remember his name. His eyes started to close, the darkness calling to him, promising an end to the cold and the pain and the loneliness. But then he heard something, a sound that cut through the fog in his mind, a creaking noise that meant the door was opening. Warm air washed over him like a wave, and through his half-closed eyes he saw a figure standing above him, looking down at him with an expression he could not read. The figure knelt down, coming closer, and Vyrath saw that it was a human male, older than the others, with gray hair and lines on his face that spoke of many years and many sorrows. The man said something in a soft voice, words that the broken translator turned into meaningless static, but the tone was gentle, kind, without any of the fear or anger that the others had shown. Then the man reached out his hands, not to push Vyrath away, not to hurt him, but to pick him up, to lift him from the cold snow and carry him into the warmth. Vyrath tried to say thank you, tried to express his gratitude in some way, but he was too weak to speak, too tired to do anything except let himself be carried. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the man's face looking down at him, with something that might have been compassion, might have been understanding, might have been the simple recognition of one lonely creature seeing another. Then everything went dark, and Vyrath knew nothing more. Vyrath woke up slowly, his mind swimming up from the darkness like a fish rising to the surface of a deep pond. The first thing he noticed was the warmth, a beautiful, wonderful warmth that wrapped around his whole body like a blanket made of sunshine. For a moment he thought he was back home on his desert world, lying in the warm sand, while his mother sang old songs in the language of their ancestors. But then he opened his eyes and saw an unfamiliar ceiling, made of wood, lit by the dancing orange glow of a fire, and he remembered everything that had happened. The attack on the ship, the escape pod, the crash, the cold, the doors that would not open, and finally the man with gray hair, who had carried him inside. Vyrath tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate, too weak and too tired to follow his commands. He managed to turn his head and look around the room, taking in his surroundings with the curiosity that all young dragons do. Possessed. The room was simple but comfortable, with old furniture that had been well cared for over many years. A fire burned in a stone fireplace across from where Vyrath lay, the flames crackling and popping as they consumed the wood, sending waves of heat across the room. He was lying on a soft surface, some kind of bed or couch, covered with several thick blankets that held the warmth close to his scales. His left wing had been wrapped in white cloth, bandaged carefully in a way that kept it still and prevented further damage. The cut above his eye had been cleaned and covered with some kind of healing patch, and when he moved his head, he felt only a dull ache instead of the sharp pain from before. Someone had taken care of him, had treated his wounds with skill and gentleness, had made sure he was warm and safe. Vyrath heard a sound from another part of the house, footsteps coming closer, and then the man appeared in the doorway, carrying a bowl in his hands, steam rising from whatever was inside, and when he saw that Vyrath was awake, his face changed into an expression that the young dragon did not recognize at first. It took him a moment to understand that the expression was a smile, a human way of showing happiness or friendliness. The man walked over slowly, making no sudden movements, being careful not to frighten the small dragon on his couch. He knelt down beside Vyrath and held out the bowl, speaking in a soft voice that rumbled like distant thunder. The translator chip crackled and hissed, but this time it managed to catch some of the words. The man said his name was Connor Webb, that Vyrath was safe, that no one would hurt him here. Vyrath wanted to respond, but his throat was too dry, his voice lost somewhere in the fog of exhaustion that still filled his body. Connor seemed to understand, and he brought the bowl closer, tilting it so Vyrath could see what was inside. It was some kind of soup or broth, a golden liquid with bits of vegetables floating in it, and the smell of it made Vyrath's empty stomach growl with hunger. He had not eaten since before the attack on the ship, and his body was desperate for food. Connor helped him drink from the bowl, holding it steady while Vyrath took small sips, the warm liquid spreading through his chest and belly like a healing fire. The broth was not like anything Vyrath had tasted before. flavored with herbs and spices from this alien world. But it was good, so good that he finished the whole bowl and wanted more. Connor laughed softly at the young dragon's appetite and went to get another bowl, returning quickly and helping Vyrath drink that one too. After the second bowl, Vyrath felt strong enough to speak, his voice coming out rough and scratchy, but understandable. He said thank you in his own language first, the Draconeth words for gratitude that carried more meaning than any translation could capture. Then he tried to say it in English, remembering the word from his lessons with his mother, his pronunciation clumsy but clear enough. Connor's eyes grew wet when he heard it, water gathering at the edges, and Vyrath wondered if he had said something wrong. But then Connor smiled again, and patted Vyrath gently on his uninjured shoulder, and the young dragon understood that the water in the man's eyes was not from sadness, but from some other emotion, something good that he did not have a name for. The next few hours passed in a blur of rest and food and warmth. Connor kept the fire burning hot, adding more wood whenever the flames started to die down, making sure the room stayed at a temperature that was comfortable for a desert creature. He brought more broth, then some kind of soft bread that Vyrath could tear apart with his small claws, then a warm drink that tasted sweet and helped him relax. Between the two meals, and the warmth and the gentle care, Vyrath felt his strength slowly returning, his scales regaining some of their bright green color, his thoughts becoming clearer and more organized. When night came, Connor brought extra blankets and made sure Vyrath was comfortable before going to his own bed in another room. Vyrath lay awake for a long time, looking at the fire, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about his parents and wondered if they were alive, if they were looking for him, if they would ever find him on this frozen world. He thought about the other humans who had turned him away, the woman who screamed, the family who ignored his knocking, the man with the gun. And he thought about Connor Webb, the man who had opened his door to a strange creature bleeding in the snow, who had taken him in without asking for anything in return, who had treated his wounds and fed him and kept him warm. Vyrath did not understand why Connor had helped him when the others had refused. He did not know what made this one human different from all the rest. But as he lay there in the warmth of the fire, wrapped in soft blankets, safe for the first time since the attack on his family's ship, Vyrath made a promise to himself. He promised that he would never forget this kindness, that he would find a way to repay Connor for saving his life, that he would tell everyone he ever met about the human who opened his door and his heart to a cold and injured dragon baby. With that promise settled in his mind, like a warm stone in his chest, Vyrath finally let his eyes close and drifted off to sleep. He dreamed of his mother singing, of his father laughing, of warm sands and clear skies, and in his dreams, Connor Webb was there too, sitting by a fire, smiling his human smile, part of a family that spanned 2 worlds and 2 species. It was a good dream, and Vyrath held on to it as the night passed and the fire crackled and the snow fell silently outside the window of the small house where a lonely man had found something worth caring for again. Days turned into weeks as Vyrath recovered in Connor Webb's small house on the frozen colony world. Connor had contacted the Colonial Authority on the 2nd day, using an old communication device that crackled and hummed with age, and they had passed his message to the Draconeth Embassy on the nearest space station. The news came back mixed, both wonderful and difficult at the same time. Vyrath's parents were alive, having survived the raider attack on their ship. But his mother had suffered terrible burns across half her body, and his father had lost an eye in the fighting. They were recovering in a medical facility on the station, too injured to travel, waiting for the moment when they could come and collect their son. But the storms on Kepler 442b were fierce during this season, the embassy official explained, and no ships could land safely until the weather cleared. It would be at least 2 weeks maybe 3, before a rescue vessel could reach them. Colony. Connor listened to this news and nodded his head and said that he would take care of Vyrath until then, that the young dragon was welcome in his home for as long as needed. When Vyrath heard that his parents were alive, he cried for the first time since the crash, tears streaming down his green scales, his small body shaking with relief and joy and lingering fear all mixed together. Connor held him through it, not saying anything, just being there, a steady presence in a universe that had become so uncertain. As the days passed, Vyrath and Connor began to learn about each other in the way that only two creatures living closely together can. Vyrath learned that Connor had been a medic in something called the Colonial Defense Force many years ago, that he had traveled to many worlds and seen many terrible things during his service. He learned that Connor had lost his wife to a sickness called cancer when he was 40 years old, had died in a war on a distant planet 5 years later. Connor lived alone on this frozen world because he had nowhere else to go and no one left to go there with, because the cold outside matched the cold he felt inside his heart. But Vyrath also learned that Connor was kind in ways that went deeper than simple actions. He learned that Connor woke up early every morning to check on him, to make sure his wing was healing properly, to prepare food that was hot enough for a fire-breathing creature to enjoy. He learned that Connor sat with him during the long, dark hours when nightmares about the attack woke Vyrath from his sleep, speaking in a soft voice about nothing important, just letting the sound of his words chase away the fear. Connor learned things about Vyrath, too. He learned that young Draconeth were curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why people did what they did. Vyrath liked his food so hot that it would burn a human's mouth, and that the young dragon slept better when the fire crackled loudly, the sound reminding him of his homeworld. He learned that Vyrath had a laugh that sounded like small bells ringing, and that when he was happy, his scales seemed to glow brighter, the green becoming more vivid and alive. Most importantly, Connor learned that taking care of someone, being needed by someone, feeling responsible for another living creature, had awakened something inside him that he thought had died with his family. He started to smile more, laugh more, talk more, as if the presence of the young dragon had broken through a wall of grief that had surrounded him for years. They learned each other's languages slowly, word by word, phrase by phrase, building a bridge between their two worlds, one piece at a time. Connor would point at objects around the house and say the English words for them, and Vyrath would repeat them in his high young voice, sometimes getting them wrong in ways that made Connor laugh. Then Vyrath would teach Connor the Draconeth words, the sounds that required a forked tongue and a throat designed for breathing fire, and Connor would try his best to pronounce them, usually failing in ways that made Vyrath laugh in return. The first full sentence Vyrath spoke in English came on the 10th day of his stay. He looked at Connor across the dinner table, his bowl of steaming broth held in his small claws, and said, "Thank you for not being afraid of me." Connor stopped eating, his eyes growing wet again the way they had on that first night, and he set down his spoon and looked at the young dragon with an expression full of emotions that Vyrath was only beginning to understand. Then Connor spoke in Draconeth, his pronunciation terrible, but his meaning clear. Fear is a choice, and kindness is also a choice. Vyrath stared at him in surprise, because he had not taught Connor those words yet, which meant the man had been studying on his own, learning in secret, preparing this gift for the young dragon who had crashed into his life. They finished their dinner in comfortable silence, but something had changed between them. Some barrier had fallen. Some new understanding had been reached. When the Draconeth ship finally arrived, 2.5 weeks after the crash, the crew members found something they had not expected. They found Vyrath sitting by the fire, listening to Connor tell stories about a planet called Earth, a blue and green world covered in oceans and forests that sounded like paradise to a creature from the desert. They found a young dragon speaking English with a strange accent, and a human man trying to pronounce Draconeth words with a tongue that was not designed for them. They found two beings from completely different worlds who had become something more than host and guest, more than rescuer and rescued, something that neither species had a proper word for. When it came time for Vyrath to leave, to board the ship and fly to the station where his parents waited, the young dragon did not want to go. He stood at the door of Connor's house, looking back at the room where he had been nursed back to health, at the fire that had kept him warm, at the man who had saved his life when everyone else had turned away. Connor knelt down to look Vyrath in the eyes, the way he had that first night when he found a dying dragon on his doorstep. He said that Vyrath had to go, that his parents needed him, that this was not goodbye forever, but only goodbye for now. He said that Vyrath was always welcome in his home, that there would always be a fire burning for him, that he would always have a place here whenever he wanted to return. Vyrath threw his small arms around Connor's neck and held on tight, his scales pressing against the man's rough cheek, his heart pounding, breaking, and healing at the same time. Then he let go and walked to the ship, looking back one last time before climbing aboard. Connor stood in the doorway of his house, his hand raised in farewell, his smile sad but real. A man who had found something worth caring about again, and was now watching it fly away into the stars. The ship lifted off, and Vyrath pressed his face against the window, watching the frozen world grow smaller below him, watching Connor's house become a tiny dot of light in the white landscape. He made another promise to himself in that moment, a promise even more important than the first one. He promised that he would come back, that he would see Connor again, that he would find a way to show the galaxy what humans were really capable of when they chose kindness over fear. The ship turned toward the stars, and Vyrath carried that promise with him like a fire burning in his chest, warm and bright and impossible to extinguish. The reunion with his parents was everything Vyrath had dreamed about during his long, cold nights on the frozen world. His mother swept him into her arms the moment he stepped off the ship, her great wings wrapping around him despite the bandages that still covered half her body, her tears falling hot against his scales as she held him close. His father stood behind her, his face marked by a patch where his left eye used to be, but his remaining eye shining with joy and relief as he watched his wife and son embrace. They held each other for a long time in the docking bay of the space station, a family reunited against all odds, survivors of a nightmare that could have torn them apart forever. In the days that followed, Vyrath told his parents everything that had happened to him. He told them about the crash and the cold, about the doors that would not open, and the humans who turned him away. And then he told them about Connor Webb, the man with gray hair and sad eyes, who had opened his door and his heart to a dying dragon child. His parents listened in silence, their expressions growing more serious as the story went on. When Vyrath finished, his father sat back in his chair and was quiet for a very long time, thinking about what his son had said. In Draconeth culture, there was a concept that had no direct translation in human languages. The closest approximation was life debt, but that did not capture the full meaning. When someone saved the life of a Draconeth, especially a child, the debt created was sacred, unbreakable, binding not just the individual, but the entire family line for generations. Vyrath's father understood that Connor Webb had done something that could never be repaid with money or goods or simple thanks. The human had given something precious beyond measure, and the only way to honor that gift was to give something precious in return. 6 months after the reunion, Vyrath's father traveled to the Draconeth homeworld and requested an audience with the High Council, the governing body of their entire species. He stood before 1,000 dragons, the most powerful and respected members of their civilization, and told them the story of his son. He told them about the crash and the cold, the rejections and the fear, and then he told them about Connor Webb. He told them that perhaps the Draconeth had been wrong about humans, that perhaps there was more to this species than their reputation for violence and endless expansion across the galaxy. He told them that if one human could show such kindness to a stranger, to a creature that looked nothing like him, then maybe there were others like him. Maybe kindness was more common among humans than the Draconeth had believed. The council listened, and when the story was finished, they debated for 3 days and 3 nights. Some argued that one human's actions did not represent the whole species, his entire species, that humans were still dangerous and unpredictable, and best avoided. Others argued that the Draconeth had isolated themselves for too long, that building bridges with other species was necessary for survival in a changing galaxy. In the end, the decision was made to reach out, to take a risk, to trust in the possibility that what Connor Webb had shown was not an exception, but a glimpse of something deeper in the human spirit. And so, for the first time in the history of the galaxy, a human was invited to address the Draconeth Assembly. Connor Webb received the message on a cold morning in his small house on Kepler 442b. He read it 3 times, convinced that his old eyes were playing tricks on him, then sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the fire for a long time. A month later, he stood in the great hall of the Draconeth homeworld, surrounded by creatures of scale and fire, beings that had been legends and monsters in human mythology. Stories for centuries. He was terrified, more frightened than he had ever been in all his years as a soldier and a medic. But he had learned something from a small green dragon who had crashed into his life. He had learned that fear was a choice, and so was courage. Connor spoke simply, without fancy words or grand speeches, telling the assembled dragons the same thing he would have told anyone who asked. He said that he had done nothing special, that any decent being would have done the same for a hurt child, that kindness was not uniquely human, but something that existed in all species, waiting to be chosen. He said that humanity was not defined by its worst members, but by its choices in the moments that mattered. He said that kindness was a language that needed no translation, that it spoke directly from heart to heart, crossing all the barriers that seemed so important and solid until they were tested. When he finished speaking, the hall was silent for a long moment. Then the eldest dragon, a massive creature whose scales had turned silver with age, rose from her seat and walked down to where Connor stood. She bowed her great head before him, a gesture of respect that had never been offered to an outsider in the 1,000-year history of the Assembly. She called him Fire Brother, a title reserved for the greatest heroes of the Draconeth people, and placed around his neck a pendant made of dragon glass, a crystal that burned with inner fire and never grew cold. Connor's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the honor, looking out at the sea of dragons before him, finding in the crowd a young green dragon whose scales glowed brighter than all the others. Vyrath smiled at him, and Connor smiled back, and in that moment they both knew that what had started with a knock on a door had become something much larger than either of them could have imagined. In the years that followed, everything. Trade agreements were signed between humans and Draconeth. Cultural exchanges began. Embassies were established on both sides. Young dragons visited human worlds to learn, and young humans traveled to Draconeth space to study. The two species, who had once viewed each other with fear and suspicion, began to understand that they had more in common than anyone had believed. 20 years after the night when Connor Webb opened his door to a freezing dragon child, Vyrath returned to Kepler 442b. He was grown now, tall and strong, his scales gleaming like polished emeralds, his wings spread wide and powerful. He had become the first Draconeth ambassador to Earth, a position of great honor that he had worked toward his entire adult life. He brought his own children with him, 2 young dragons whose scales shimmered with hints of gold, to meet the human who had changed the course of galactic history. Connor was old now, his hair completely white, his body bent by the weight of years, but his eyes still held the same kindness that Vyrath remembered from that frozen night so long ago. The children asked Connor why he had helped their father when everyone else had refused. Connor looked at Vyrath, at the dragon who had grown from a wounded child into a leader and a bridge between worlds, and he smiled the same smile he had worn on the night when he chose to open his door instead of keeping it closed. He said, "Because that is what humans do, at least the ones who remember what really matters." Vyrath knelt down and embraced his old friend, holding him gently, careful of the fragile human body that housed such a strong spirit. He whispered in Connor's ear, speaking in perfect Draconeth, the words that had bridged their worlds from the very beginning. He said, "Thank you for not being afraid." And Connor, speaking in Draconeth that had improved over 20 years of practice, replied, "You for knocking on my door." Outside the window, the snow fell gently on the frozen world, covering everything in white silence, while inside the small house, a fire burned worn and bright, as it always had, as it always would, a beacon of hope in a universe that was learning, slowly but surely, that kindness was the most powerful force of all.